Hello again, my name is Steve Hillis, and we're going to finish up our lecture series on conflict theories or the conflict perspective. Think back to when we first started this series of discussions. We emphasized four basic concepts or concerns that were something that was widely shared by almost all conflict theorists. First of all, a huge emphasis on large-scale social conflict, various ways in which large groups of people, organizations, and so forth struggle to gain more power, to gain more resources, to gain advantages over each other. It's a dog-eat-dog world. Society is basically a war, and the idea is that social conflict shapes pretty much everything around us. Secondly, a huge emphasis on power. Power is a weapon, a tool, a resource, the ability to impose your will upon others despite their resistance. Power comes in various forms. Conflict theory studies a wide range of different types of power, how groups acquire power, how they use it, and ultimately how it is that groups that have more power tend to dominate groups that have less power when those groups come into direct or indirect conflict. Also, conflict theorists place a great emphasis on social inequality. Social inequality can come in many forms as well. Inequality in terms of economic terms, in terms of resources, social resources, political resources, economic resources, and so forth. And finally, conflict theorists place a great emphasis on social change, particularly large-scale social change, major transformations in the way that society works, the way it looks. Social change, according to conflict theorists, are driven in large part by large-scale social conflict. Conflict begets change, which in turn often begets more conflict. At any rate, I want to point out before we leave these topics that you probably shouldn't look at these things like a checklist or a laundry list, as a series of unconnected ideas. Rather, conflict theory really is all about studying the relationship between conflict, power, inequality, and social change. Just to give you a little taste of how that might work. Conflict is largely determined by which groups have more or less power. And the result of power and conflict is to produce patterns of inequality, which feed back on, well, who fights with who, over what, who wins, and who has more power and less power. At the same time, conflict produces social change. Social change, in turn, can produce conflict, or it can produce changing patterns of inequality. It can produce changing distributions of power, changing who winds up winners and who winds up losers. All of these basic things are connected to each other. You change one, you change others. Conflict theory looks not just at each individual idea in isolation, but a lot of times combines them and sees how they interact or how they're interconnected. Now, before we finish with conflict theory, I also should mention that conflict theorists use a wide variety of other concepts. They have other concerns as well. And at least I want to mention a few of them just to give you a flavor for how that might work. Many conflict theorists don't just look at power, they also look at authority, what Max Weber defined as legitimized power. So, the idea is sometimes we follow people's rules, we follow people's orders, not because they have raw power over us, because, well, we respect their authority. To quote the great philosopher Eric Cartman from South Park, respect my authority. Well, you get the idea. Point is that sometimes you follow rules because you think the person giving the rules have the right to, that you ought to follow them. Now, we don't have time right now to get into any details talking about authority, but as soon as you start talking about authority, you start talking about legitimacy, how people defend their authority, how they hold on to it, how they create their authority in the first place. So a lot of functionalists, a lot of conflict theorists, focus not just on power but authority and legitimation. Why? Because, well, a lot of times conflict involves organized groups. And authority is critical to running organizations, including organized conflict groups. Groups of people that are poorly organized or whose leaders have very little authority often fail in competition. Or focus on it a different way. A lot of times, authority itself is an important tool or weapon to be used in conflict. People fight over authority, and sometimes people try to delegitimize their opponent in various ways, tear down their authority. So some conflict theorists place as much or more emphasis on things like legitimation and authority than they do on power. Other conflict theorists will place emphasis on things like status and prestige. Remember that conflict theorists are interested in all forms of social inequality. It's easy to think of inequality in terms of things like access to health care or money or income, but sometimes we have inequality of things that are intangible. Symbolic social rewards or resources, things like status, popularity, prestige. Not everybody can be the most popular kid in class. Not everyone can belong to the most popular clique. There's a social hierarchy in terms of things like status and prestige. And once again, that's a form of inequality. It's something that people fight to climb up the ladder of social status, or they try to resist being put down. Social status influences who we listen to, who we pay attention to, who we trust. So sometimes social status and prestige has other implications for things like what groups of people have the most influence on public opinion. At any rate, the point is that some sociologists, particularly conflict theorists, place great premium on studying symbolic forms of inequality, things like status and prestige, as much or more so than they might focus on inequality of other things like income. And finally, many conflict theorists place a great emphasis on social movements, conflict organizations, and resource mobilization. If you're studying social conflict, it only makes sense to talk about conflict groups, large conflict groups, organized conflict groups. If you look back at the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and so forth, the women's movement, the women's liberation movement, and so forth, you see that these are groups that were highly organized. They had strategies, they had members, they had resources, and they constantly went out and tried to mobilize and organize resources. They recruited people, they raised money, they engaged in all sorts of demonstrations, tactics, tricks. They tried to gain access to the media. They tried to gain attention for their cause. They tried to frame themselves and their issue in the way they wanted to. In other words, according to this line of thought, you couldn't really understand these social movements or the underlying conflict in which they were involved with without understanding how they were organized, how sometimes they became disorganized and what problems that caused them, how it was that they mobilized and used resources. Again, these are issues that interest many sociologists, especially conflict theorists. And by the way, they also interest a lot of conflict theory related research in political science as well. Well, that pretty much says everything I want to say about these other major concerns and concepts. By the way, there are still others. But for right now, I'd like to turn to one last topic as we wind down on conflict theory. And that is, why so much emphasis on inequality? Conflict theorists clearly are, well, fascinated, sometimes almost obsessed by all forms of social inequality. The key question is why? Well, some of it probably is ideological. Many conflict theorists believe that it's a matter of social justice. It's all about living in a fairer, better society. That's a philosophical position that you may or may not agree with, but at least it is part of the motivation for this strong emphasis on inequality. But it's not the only one. Even if you do not believe in social justice or something that is not important to you, there's still other reasons to be interested in social inequality. First of all, social inequality is correlated, associated with so many other things. Just take one example. Crime. Who is a victim of crime? Who commits crimes? Who's incarcerated for crimes? Well, guess what? You can predict a lot about those things by looking at someone's social class, how much income they have, how much wealth they have, what kind of neighborhood they came from, how much education they have, and so forth. Some people, some groups, some communities have a lot more crime than others. So, by understanding inequality, we understand more about crime. But that's only one example. Inequality, in various forms, is associated or statistically correlated with a wide range of different kinds of social phenomena. So, it's not surprising that so many sociologists began to become interested in social inequality and how it related to other aspects of society. Also, it's worth pointing out that social inequality, whatever its causes, has many consequences. A lot of times, social problems that are widespread, that really hurt people, are strongly associated with social inequality, which raises questions about what we should do about it, how we should view it, and ultimately inspires a lot of research and interest into social inequality. Whatever the case, conflict theorists do continue to place great emphasis on social inequality in a lot of their research, really in most of it. That finishes up our discussion of conflict theories. Our next lecture series is going to be on interactionism. Thank you very much, and I guess we'll see you next time. Thanks again.